Picture a Tuesday morning. You've been up since 6. You made what you always make, the same breakfast you've eaten for 15 years. The one you switched to specifically because someone told you it was good for you. You feel fine. You feel responsible. And then your granddaughter runs into the kitchen. She looks up at you, and for 4 full seconds, her name is simply not there. You find it. You cover the pause. But you stood in your own kitchen, in front of a child you would walk through fire for, and your brain handed you nothing. What I'm about to tell you is something most doctors will not say out loud in a 15-minute appointment. That breakfast you've been eating, the one you were told was helping, may be one of the primary reasons that keeps happening. And if you're reaching for names and coming up empty, you need to hear this before tomorrow morning. I'm Dr. Eleanor Vance. I've spent 32 years in clinical neurology, and for the last decade, a significant portion of my work has focused specifically on early cognitive change in adults over 50. Patients whose standard lab panels look completely normal, but who are losing something quietly and consistently. Names, words, the thread of a thought mid-sentence. What I've had to accept, and what I find professionally embarrassing about my own field, is how badly we have failed these patients on the question of diet. Not because the advice was malicious, because it was designed for the heart. The cardiovascular guidelines that became the backbone of mainstream breakfast nutrition were never evaluated through a neurological lens. Low-fat, high-carbohydrate, fruit-forward, fortified grain breakfasts were handed to an entire generation of older adults as the responsible choice. And from the perspective of cognitive neurochemistry, several of those staples are quietly accelerating exactly the kind of damage we're trying to prevent. Research examining antioxidant defense pathways in the aging brain has made clear that when the brain is subjected to a chronic oxidative load, repeated daily, compounded over years, its own natural repair mechanisms begin to suppress. The NRF2 pathway, one of the brain's primary cellular defenses against oxidative damage, becomes less responsive. The brain starts losing its ability to protect itself. And the primary dietary driver of that suppression isn't sugar in a candy bar. It is specific compounds produced at breakfast tables across the country every single morning. This channel is built around a single commitment: giving you the clinical information that protects your ability to stay sharp, stay independent, and stay fully yourself. The kind of information that should have been part of your last doctor's appointment, but wasn't, because there isn't time. If that matters to you, subscribe. Not for the numbers, because you deserve a source that talks to you like a capable adult, not a liability to be managed. And if this morning's scenario felt uncomfortably close to something real in your life, type the word breakfast in the comments right now. Because what is sitting on your kitchen counter may be working against you in ways no one has connected for you yet. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to look for. Here is what I want you to genuinely understand, not as a diet tip, but as neuroscience. When certain foods are digested, particularly those with a high glycemic load and specific processing compounds, they produce what are called advanced glycation end products, AGEs. These molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier, and once they're in neural tissue, they trigger a cascade of inflammatory and oxidative responses. It's a chemical stress that accumulates, not acutely, like a headache, but slowly, the way sediment builds up in a pipe over years until the flow drops to a trickle. That sediment is the problem. Your brain processes, stores, and retrieves information through networks of connected neurons. Those networks depend on clear, efficient chemical signaling. But when oxidative residue accumulates in neural tissue, when tau proteins and beta amyloid compounds are not being adequately cleared, and when the brain's nerve growth factor production is being suppressed by chronic neuroinflammation, the signal cannot travel cleanly. What you experience at the surface is a word that won't come, a name that hovers just out of reach. What is actually happening beneath the surface is that the memory is intact, but something is sitting between you and it. Interference. Neurochemical static generated in part by what you ate that morning. Think of it like an oil filter that's never been changed. The engine is still running, the oil is still in the system, but the filter is fouled with so much accumulated residue that it can no longer do its job, and the moving parts begin to wear from the inside. You don't notice the damage in real time. You notice it when something seizes. A 2023 study published in Molecules identified a compound isolated from tamarind that produced measurable reductions in exactly those tau and beta amyloid levels, the two primary structural markers of this kind of neurochemical interference, alongside real improvements in spatial memory function in research models. The mechanism is not theoretical, and it is not permanent, but it has to be addressed at its actual source. I want to speak to what you have already tried, because I've heard these in my exam rooms more times than I can count. The Mediterranean diet is a legitimate cardiovascular framework. It is not a targeted neurological intervention. Its timeline for cognitive impact in patients already experiencing symptoms is measured in years, and it does nothing to address the specific toxic accumulation already sitting in the pathways. Brain food lists, blueberries, avocado toast, salmon, nuts, these add beneficial input, but they do not clear existing interference. Adding nutrients to a clogged system is like pouring clean water into a fouled filter. It helps at the margins. It does not fix the underlying blockage. And if you've tried cutting caffeine because someone told you it was contributing to the fog, and the fog didn't lift, that's because coffee was never the problem. You were solving for the wrong variable. You were not making lazy choices. You were acting on advice that was never designed to address what is actually happening in your brain. That distinction matters. Here is what happens when the root interference is genuinely addressed. Day 1. The shift is subtle, and I want to be honest about that, because anything promising dramatic results on day 1 is not telling you the truth. What begins is a quieting. The oxidative load that has been arriving with every breakfast starts to ease. Neuroinflammation that has been subtly constricting the brain's chemical signaling pathways begins to settle. You may feel fractionally clearer by late morning. Not sharp, not yet. Just slightly less underwater than usual. Before I go further, I want to say this clearly. This only produces meaningful results with the right intervention, one that actually targets the specific failure points driving the interference, not a general wellness formula that adds vitamins to a broken system. The wrong choice here produces nothing because it never reaches the mechanism. Day 3. You're at Sunday brunch. Someone across the table mentions a name. Someone from years ago, a mutual friend you've been reaching for and missing in conversation for months. And it comes. Not after a beat, not after a careful scan. It just comes. But what my patients talk about most is not the recall itself. It's the silence where the fear used to be. That involuntary chest tightening that precedes every social moment involving a name or a word. The split-second bracing that has become so habitual you stopped noticing it simply doesn't arrive. You reach, it's there, and you stay present in the conversation instead of disappearing into a private panic no one else can see. Day 2. What was happening beneath the surface? That moment at brunch was built on something invisible that was happening 48 hours earlier. Cellular autophagy, the brain's own internal cleanup process, had begun accelerating, beginning to break down tau protein deposits that had been accumulating in neural pathways. Antioxidant enzyme activity, including the GPX and SOD pathways suppressed by chronic dietary oxidative load, was beginning to recover. And nerve growth factor synthesis, The biological signal that maintains and rebuilds neural connections was starting to come back online. You felt none of that on day 2, but everything that was restored on day 3 was earned then. Day 5. Something changes in the room. You're at dinner with family, and you hold the thread of a long story, the kind that would have frayed 3 weeks ago, that would have required you to rehearse in advance just to feel safe saying it out loud in front of people who notice when you stumble. You don't rehearse, you just talk. And someone, a sibling, an old friend, looks at you and says, "You seem really like yourself tonight." They mean it as a compliment. You hear it as confirmation that what you were afraid was already gone is not gone. The fear of being quietly reclassified as someone who needs to be watched, that specific, slow dread, starts to soften. Day 7. Patients consistently describe this as a recognition, not a transformation. Not a new brain, the original one, operating closer to what it was designed to do, sharp enough to be present, clear enough to stop managing every conversation from the inside. In the morning, in their own kitchen, making breakfast that is no longer working against them, they feel like the person who belongs in that room. After everything I've described, the age accumulation, the oxidative suppression of the brain's own defense pathways, the tau and beta amyloid residue sitting in the neural architecture, most products marketed for brain health address none of it. Let me be specific about what a real solution must do. First, it must stimulate nerve growth factor synthesis. Not gesture toward it, drive it. NGF is the biological signal the brain uses to maintain, repair, and rebuild the neural connections that months of neuroinflammatory damage have eroded. Second, it must actively scavenge reactive oxygen species from neural tissue. Not with a generic antioxidant the body distributes broadly, but with compounds that have demonstrated specific neuroprotective activity at the cellular level. Third, it must reduce tau and beta amyloid accumulation directly. Not slow future buildup, clear present buildup. That distinction is the entire gap between a formula that produces a felt result and one that produces nothing. Fourth, it must actually absorb and reach the brain in meaningful concentration. The majority of capsules and tablets lose potency before they cross the blood-brain barrier. Delivery mechanism is not a marketing detail. It is half of whether any of this matters in practice. Most formulas meet one of these at best. What you need meets all 4. Neuroprime is what I found that meets every one of those criteria. And I want to be direct about that because I don't make that statement casually. It is a liquid drop formula, not a capsule, which is the reason absorption isn't the bottleneck it is with standard supplements. Among its 9 ingredients is the tamarind isolate connected to the tau and beta amyloid research I described earlier, and lion's mane, which is directly linked to nerve growth factor synthesis. I am not going to read you the full ingredient list here. What I will tell you is that the page linked below this video breaks down the full mechanism, why each ingredient was chosen, what it targets, and what the research behind it actually says. If what I've walked you through today maps onto what you've been experiencing at your own breakfast table, that is the logical next place to go. 1 drop each morning, under the tongue or stirred into whatever you're already drinking. 10 seconds. No new routine, no dietary overhaul, no complicated regimen to maintain alongside everything else in your day. A noticeable shift in morning clarity for most people arrives within the first week. Not dramatic, but real. Full and sustained results build over 30 to 60 days. I would rather undersell the timeline and have you experience something genuine than overstate it and lose your trust. There is a 365-day money-back guarantee attached to this. Full refund, no questions, return whatever you have left. The financial exposure of trying it is effectively 0. Only you can put a number on the cost of not trying it. One last thing before you go. Type the word sharp in the comments, because choosing to protect your clarity, deciding that what's been slipping away is worth fighting for, is a deliberate act. Mark it. And if someone in your life has been laughing off the forgotten names, the lost words, the moments where the room goes briefly out of reach, and you can see they've stopped finding it funny, share this video with them. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of care that changes a morning. What is sitting on your breakfast counter tomorrow is a decision. You now know something about it that most people don't. Use it.